It's going to start out in something we're familiar with. I'm going to introduce you to the concepts of terrorism, Islamism, and we're going to put the two things together to talk about what makes Islamist terrorism. And then we're going to start looking at something called jihad and comparing it to the Crusades. So after I get us started, you're going to be turned loose with some readings and the other people at your group of desks to start comparing and contrasting Crusades and jihad. For each of these, you're going to have a question about both that will allow you to make a comparison, and I want you to tell me what was it in the readings that got you to that answer. And again, you're going to be able to talk this through, work with your group. But for us to get there, we need to start with the notes. It looks like, no, okay, we're good. All right, you do not need to go to Pear Deck, by the way. Why Slides is doing that? Bless you. Our objectives at this point, we know. I want us to understand the basics and the background of the violence. Part of that is going to be knowing which groups are involved. Iris, you keep along, keep up with notes packet there. Knowing who the groups are will let us try to understand what's motivating them to participate in terrorism. Of course, I want us to move towards being able to figure out which motives matter most, is the religious, maybe or private or ulterior motives. And then finally, to continue to build your ability to take a position on the question of whether religious conflicts are really about religion or about something else. And for this, we've got some definitions to do. And they're kind of long and kind of ugly. No way of pretending they're not. Now with these, this is typical. I will try to help you break it down. Terrorism is the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence. What makes it illegal is that it is carried out by non-state actors. And the point of this violence is to achieve a goal. It could be political, it could be economic, it could be religious or social. There are lots of instances of terrorism that really aren't about religion, and there's not anybody trying to tell you that they are. We're focused on a particular type of terrorism. The part we're probably most unfamiliar with in that definition is the non-state actor. And here when we say an actor, not talking about Channing Tatum, not talking about Kevin Hart, pick your other actor. I'm talking about just somebody who is acting, who takes an action. And read the hood down, please. Thank you. And it's a person or a group that is acting without permission or authority from a country, particularly from a country's government. So Vladimir Putin might be doing really horrible things in Ukraine, using drones to attack civilian targets, using artillery to hit civilian targets. Those are all horrible. Those are not terrorism, because Vladimir Putin is a state actor. He not only has the authority of the state and the permission, but he is in charge of the state we call the Russian Federation. Likewise, the Wagner Group, it's a bunch of mercenaries. Remember, we've met mercenaries before. They're guns for hire. They are fighting for the Russian government, but they are being paid by and they have the authority of the Russian government. So they may be committing war crimes, but they're not committing terrorism. So then what are non-state actors? Well, first, I want to be clear, they don't have to be engaging in violence. Apple and other businesses like McDonald's are non-state actors. Similarly, charities, not-for-profits. You could take your pick, Feed the Children, the International Red Cross. The example up there is Doctors Without Borders. They don't act with the authority of government. They're not hurting people. They're going to provide medical care, often in places that are very dangerous to the doctors. And they can also be clubs. There's the Key Club International for high school students. If you are even more boring than I am, there are international clubs for people who collect postage stamps. Not knocking them, but it does seem to be more boring than most of the things that even I do. And then, of course, with non-state actors, there are also the ones that do violence. And that's the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda that we will be focusing on. What makes terrorism Islamist? Well, to know that, we have to know what Islamist or Islamism means. This is another, in this case, even bigger, nastier definition, but this one is really, of the two, for me, particularly important because I want us to be very careful in understanding that Islam and Islamism are not the same thing. Being a Muslim is not the same as being an Islamist. An Islamist is something very particular. And Islamism is the belief that Islamic law, often called Sharia law, should be a guiding force, if not the guiding force, in people's public life. So not just what they do at home, but what they do when they're out and about with other people, at work, at school, at the store. And this is because Islamists feel that Islam instructs how politics should be done, how the law should be enforced, and how people, even people who are not Muslims, should behave. And that's what makes the difference. Muslims practice Islam for themselves and let other people practice the religion they want to. Islamism and Islamists want to impose Islamic law and practices on everybody. We can break this down further into our bullet points. Right? Societies and the governments that are in charge of those societies, making laws and enforcing laws, all of that should be based on Islam. And we do have examples of states whose governments are Islamist. One is Iran, represented by this flag. Iran does have an elected president and other elected officials, but before you can be elected by the people, you have to be approved of by a group of men called the Ayatollahs. Those are the religious authorities in Iran, and the top one of those is referred to as the supreme leader. He's not just the supreme leader of the Ayatollahs, he is the ultimate authority in all of Iran. We also have Saudi Arabia, represented by this flag. Different type of government. This is a kingdom, but it is an officially Muslim kingdom, and it very strictly enforces Islamic law and Islamic practices. As an example, this was kind of a very big deal in Saudi Arabia over the last few years. Vance, Kyla, I want you guys to brace yourselves, and I want you to be scandalized. In the last few years, the Saudi government has allowed women to drive. Cars, people, cars. And they have allowed movie theaters to open and show movies in Saudi Arabia. I know, important if you need to catch your breath on that, we can take a minute. That's how very strict Saudi Arabia has been. Progress, yeah. Now, putting these two very much together, Islamist terrorism is Islamist because of its goal. And that goal is to impose an Islamic government, or at least impose Islamic law on a country. And we have two examples of this. Al-Qaeda was the big deal when, well, I was older than you already, but Al-Qaeda was the big deal. And they had the goal of creating a caliphate. And a caliphate is kind of where religious and political authority are merged in somebody called a caliph or an emperor. And this caliph, it was going to be one massive Islamic empire running from the west coast of Africa all the way across beyond what you can see on that image to Indonesia and the Pacific Ocean. ISIS was the Islamist, well, it still is, but it's not as strong as it once was the Islamist terror group that was in the spotlight when you guys were, well, young children and hopefully not paying that much attention to the news. Their goal was to create a smaller Islamic empire, but it was going to be across Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, include parts of Europe, and, of course, with that, Spain. Oh, this is Brown. Yes, I will do it. Bye. Yes, you may. It's heavy on. Give me a minute. Got to take care of some other things. We'll get both of you out. And if you're wondering, well, why Spain, and I also shouldn't leave out Portugal, they're on the west coast. Spain and Portugal were once territories under the control of a Muslim group called the Moors. So they want to bring it back under Muslim control. And this brings us to where you guys are going to start working in the readings. You're going to start by learning about jihad. And the reading for this is posted in the Canvas page for this assignment. I'm also going to hand you a physical packet of the readings so that you don't have to bounce it back and forth as you're trying to type. You're going to start by defining the two ways of thinking about jihad. And from there, you're going to continue to use that article, but you're going to add in two more. One about the start of the Crusades, and the other about suicide terrorism in particular. And as you go, you're going to have several comparisons about the characteristics of crusade and jihad. Violent, non-violent. You get into these boxes. I want you to tell me, what was it in the readings that told you that that was the answer? You're going to see the same thing in terms of offensive or defensive purposes of crusade and jihad, proper authority to start one, and as you get closer to that final article in the list, something called martyrdom. Listen, I'm going to hand out paper copies of the readings as you work through this. I want you to work with the people. Now, before we do actually start talking about today's notes, I do want to point out where you really needed to be for the exit slip we had on Thursday of last week was, I think, slide 11 in your notes, where you read and write about martyrs. What we're kind of jumping over, sort of, this reading was kind of on your own work, are the following two slides, including, if it will stop, the big picture, comparing and contrasting of the Crusades and Jihad, two most important differences, two most important similarities, and then your opinion on whether the Crusades and Jihads have more in common than they have in different from each other, or whether they have more similarities than differences, right? And explaining your answer. So don't forget to do that. That's going to be due with the rest of your notes. But we're going to pick up here, where we meet the people who participate in Islamist terrorism. And we've got different categories of actors, just as we did with the Crusades. We have the leaders of the terrorist groups. Al-Qaeda had Osama bin Laden pictured up there. He is, of course, now deceased, killed by U.S. Special Forces at his hideout compound in Pakistan. And for ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and then, underneath the leadership, we have what we refer to typically as the rank and file. Rank and file refers to the people who are ordinary members of terrorist groups. They're not leaders. Right? They're called rank and file because if we think about an army of soldiers, right, all lined up for inspection, right, we've got rank and file. They're lined up in columns and rows, and that's what we mean. Right? Generals don't line up in columns and rows. Ordinary soldiers do. And that's how we get the term rank and file. Included here are going to be your basic fighters, right? Especially in the case of ISIS. I mean, these are going to be the guys riding around in the beds of Toyota Hilux pickup trucks, waiting to hop out and attack somewhere, or maybe launch rockets from the backs of those trucks. Might also be the people who make bombs. And it can include the people who blow themselves up as suicide bombers. Having met the players, we need to understand what motivates them. And we're going to do a brief recap of motives. motives are why a person does what they do. We've got our different types. Public, which are the reasons we tell people, are the reasons we do what we do. Private are the reasons that may not be bad, but they're the ones that we keep to ourselves. They may not sound as nice as the public reasons. And then we have ulterior motives, the reasons we work to keep secret from other people, probably because those reasons are either bad or at least selfish. And to attach examples to those, let's think about the Crusaders, right? Your crusading knights, right? Public, this is their Christian duty. The Pope called them to do this. Privately, it might be kind of adventurous to go on crusade, fight in a foreign land, maybe be a hero. And then ulterior, maybe after you've won, you're able to get some land for yourself. I'm going to start with the leaders and then move on to the rank and file. So publicly, why do the leaders of terrorist groups tell us that they are engaging in terrorist attacks? One, and this fits with the idea that jihads are supposed to be defensive. Hey, we're just doing this because we want to get non-Muslim Westerners, often referred to as infidels, out of Muslim countries. And we certainly have examples of this. Osama bin Laden got his start in the 1980s in Afghanistan, fighting against an invading army from the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was a communist country, and like most communist countries, it's officially atheist. Government policy is that there is no God. Or if it's communism in maybe a Southeast Asian country, there are no deities at all. Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, shown in this image here, and the idea was to fight and get them out. So we had the Mujahideen, who were the jihadists, fighting in Afghanistan to kick the Soviets out. And again, that's how Osama bin Laden got his start. A bit later, in the 1990s, and although the war in Afghanistan lasted until the late 80s, so we're really not that far away, and the United States, beginning especially in the early 90s, had a ton of pull in the Middle East. We'd fought the first Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We'd kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait and destroyed much of Saddam Hussein's military force, and then we kind of stuck around. Had military bases in places like Saudi Arabia. And one of the arguments, again, coming from Osama bin Laden, at this time not leading just bands of fighters in Afghanistan, but Al-Qaeda, saying he wanted the U.S. and its Western, primarily Christian allies to get out of Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, which was Osama bin Laden's home country. It wasn't just Saudi Arabia, lots of U.S. military presence in what we often refer to as the Middle East, now more commonly referred to as Southwest Asia. leaders are actually, terrorist groups, pretty big on public motives. The other one was a little more offensive, to build a modern caliphate. We mentioned caliphates earlier. Just to put a more solid definition to that now, caliphates are theocracies. They're governments based on Muslim law, ruling over a defined territory. The leader, both a political and religious leader. Much like the Ayatollahs in Iran. Remember, Muslim law typically is called Sharia law. Again, our two big examples here are going to be Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Yes. Do what? Yep. Go. And this map kind of shows these efforts. Remember, we talked previously about some ambitions of creating a caliphate that would span from Western Africa all the way out to Indonesia and the Pacific Ocean. Al-Qaeda didn't get that close. The areas of the map shaded there represent the main areas of influence for Al-Qaeda. Islamic State group there. Now, some mix of the two does cover more territory. And that's because both of those groups broadcast their motive to create new caliphates. Again, to give you some text to go along with your image, since the map itself is not labeled. Right, North Africa, across Southwest Asia, again, it's Southwest Asia, also known as the Middle East. Right, Central Asia, through places like Afghanistan, South Asia, Pakistan, India, and then on into Indonesia. Malaysia's also there. I don't want to lose sight of that. Now, what about the public motives of the rank and file jihadists? And if you're wondering, well, what about the private and ulterior motives of the leaders? We're going to come back to those. For the rank and file, a lot of the public, religious, and political goals are similar. Defend Islam, enforce Muslim law. And what makes it Islamist is that it's enforcing Muslim law not just on Muslims, but also on non-Muslims. And it's not only in the countries where those terrorists live, but also in that larger caliphate. And another public goal is to become martyrs. Martyr is someone who suffers for and likely dies for their religious beliefs. That's especially true for our suicide bombers. One thing I want to be clear about, though, in terms of suicide bombers, both groups and other groups besides the two we've mentioned by name have sometimes manipulated people with mental disabilities, and have basically tricked them into becoming suicide bombers. And in those cases, the motives don't have as much to do with it, especially not those. A lot of these people, if they were living in the United States, would probably be deemed not able to take care of themselves, even as adults, and would have some kind of person appointed by the government to make sure that they were taken care of and not taken advantage of by other people. And these are some of the folks that terrorists exploit to be suicide bombers. All right. So, as I said, we haven't mentioned private or ulterior motives yet. These are going to be the second and third videos for us in this series. I want you to list at least 3 private or ulterior motives that the leaders might have. You need to have at least one motive from each video. So you can't get all 3 from one video. And also want to think about the private or ulterior motives for the rank and file. In the case of the rank and file, I want you to list a minimum of 4 private or ulterior motives. And again, you must get at least one from each video. Now we're going to start this. We do have an exit slip. Exit slip is going to start at 8:08, so we've got a little bit of time. Again, as we watch the videos, I want you to add these to your notes. Of course, in Kami, you guys will have text boxes for that down here on those slides. As for the videos themselves, where did our videos go? Let's figure out where those videos went. Let's see if they're there. They should be. Well, hang on 1 minute. We'll figure out where those videos have gone.